Let's get started. Story number 1.
The mountains had always called to Daniel. He had spent much of his life hiking through remote stretches of wilderness, camping alone for days at a time. He liked the solitude, the peace of being surrounded by nothing but trees and sky. It was the one place where his mind could settle, where he didn't have to think about bills, his dead-end job, or the way life seemed to be slipping through his fingers. This trip was supposed to be a break. A 4-day trek through a remote section of the Montana wilderness. The area wasn't particularly well-traveled, but that's what he liked about it. He had done his research, checked maps, read about the old mining camps scattered through the hills, and planned a route that would take him through the most isolated parts of the forest. The first day went smoothly. He hiked nearly 12 miles, following a forgotten logging road until it disappeared into thick pines. He set up camp near a stream, ate a quick meal, and fell asleep to the sound of rushing water. The second day was when things changed. He had been walking for hours, navigating by compass, when he stumbled upon something that wasn't on any of the maps. A clearing in the trees, filled with broken-down cabins. They were old, the wood warped and blackened with time. Some had collapsed in on themselves, nothing more than piles of rotted beams, but a few still stood, their doorways yawning open like dark mouths. Daniel paused at the edge of the clearing, an uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He hadn't read about any settlements in this area. Logging camps, maybe, old mining shacks. But something about these buildings didn't feel right. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. He moved closer, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. The cabins were empty, their interiors stripped bare. No furniture, no tools, no signs that anyone had lived there in decades. Just dust and silence. Then he saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading from one of the cabins. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. They were human, barefoot. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line, but the woods were still. Something wasn't right. His gut told him to leave, but something else, stubbornness maybe, kept him there. He followed the footprints to the largest cabin, pushing the door open with the tip of his boot. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood, and then he saw it. At first, he thought it was just a stain, a dark patch on the wooden floor. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized it was something else, a handprint, not old, not faded, wet. Daniel stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't seen or heard another soul for 2 days. So who had left it? He turned, his instincts screaming at him to go, and that's when he saw movement in the trees. A shape. Tall. Thin. Too thin. It wasn't running. It wasn't even walking. It was just standing there, half hidden between the trees, watching. Daniel's body went cold. He stepped backward, almost tripping over the threshold of the cabin. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then, in the silence, he heard it. A whisper. Not from the trees, from behind him. He spun around, scanning the empty cabin, but there was nothing, just dust and shadows. When he turned back, the figure in the trees was gone. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pack and started moving, pushing through the underbrush as fast as his legs would carry him. He didn't follow the map. He didn't care about the trail. He just needed to get away. The whispering followed him. Soft. Just behind him. No matter how fast he moved, it was there, keeping pace. The sun was setting by the time he found another clearing, a flat patch of ground where he could set up camp. His body was screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop shaking. He built a fire larger than usual and sat with his back to a tree, his knife clutched in one hand. The woods were silent again. Not the good kind of silent. The wrong kind. The fire cast long shadows, twisting the trees into monstrous shapes. He forced himself to stay awake, his body tense with exhaustion and fear. Then, around midnight, the whispering came back, closer this time. Daniel gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the knife. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling his camp. He wanted to call out, to demand whoever or whatever it was to show itself. But something in his gut told him that was a mistake. So he sat there, listening, waiting. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't in a language he understood. The words were twisted, wrong. Then, just as suddenly as it started, silence. Daniel didn't sleep that night. At first light, he packed his gear and ran. It didn't matter that he was days away from civilization. He was getting out. The whispering didn't follow him that morning. But the feeling of being watched never left. By the time he reached the old logging road, his body was numb with exhaustion. His truck was still miles away, but he didn't stop. Then, just before the trail curved out of sight, he made the mistake of looking back. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching him. Its face was wrong, stretched, twisted, and as the wind moved through the trees, he heard it. Not a whisper, laughter. Daniel never went back, and he never hiked alone again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I grew up hiking and camping in the forests near my home in the Pacific Northwest. It was a way of life for me. Weekends were often spent on long trails, climbing ridgelines, and exploring the dark and quiet expanses of the wilderness. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had experienced nearly every corner of the region, always drawn to the solitude the wilderness offered. The woods were a refuge, a place where I could lose myself and find clarity. Or at least, that's what I thought until I found myself at the edge of something much darker than I ever expected. It was late autumn when I got a call from an old friend, Michael. He had been planning a trip into the remote areas near the Cascades for weeks and wanted me to join him. The plan was simple. Hike up to a spot called Bald Ridge, a high vantage point that overlooked a dense stretch of forest, and camp for the night before heading back down. Nothing too unusual about it, just an old-fashioned wilderness trip. It had been a while since I'd gone camping with friends, and I was eager for the adventure, so I quickly agreed. Michael had always been the more experienced hiker of the two of us, and though I knew the trail well enough, I was happy to have him lead the way. We met up early in the morning, packed our gear, and set out. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with the last remnants of autumn leaves still hanging from the trees, the sky as blue as it could be. It seemed like it would be an easy trip. The first few hours went by quickly. We made good time up the winding trail, chatting and joking like we had done so many times before. The conversation was light, and the only sound besides our voices was the crunch of leaves underfoot. The forest was alive with the occasional rustling of squirrels and birds overhead, and we felt at peace in the familiar surroundings. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, a subtle shift occurred. The forest, once welcoming, began to feel more oppressive, like the trees were closing in on us. I hadn't been in this particular stretch of woods for years, but I hadn't remembered it feeling like this before. Silent and almost too still. The quiet wasn't like the usual calm you'd find in nature. It was heavy, as though something was holding its breath. We arrived at the base of Bald Ridge just as the last light of day began to fade. The temperature dropped quickly and the wind began to pick up. We found a small clearing near the ridge, set up camp, and started a fire. The fire crackled, and we huddled near it, the warmth a relief against the biting chill in the air. The woods around us were so thick that the firelight barely reached more than a few yards in any direction. The sound of the wind through the trees seemed to increase, but it wasn't just the wind anymore. It sounded like there were whispers, faint but insistent. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the wind again. But every now and then the whispers would shift into something more distinct, almost like words. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't feel like it was coming from us or the trees. It felt like it was coming from the very earth beneath our feet, as if something ancient was trying to communicate. I glanced over at Michael to see if he had noticed, but he was distracted, checking the map and adjusting his gear. "I think I heard something," I said, my voice low, not wanting to admit how unnerved I was. Michael looked up from his map, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean? You think you heard voices?" "I don't know. Whispers. It might just be the wind." He nodded but didn't say anything, clearly brushing it off. We both sat in silence for a while, our thoughts drifting back to the fire. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they got louder as the night wore on, circling around us like a low hum, echoing through the trees. I couldn't understand them, but there was a growing sense of unease in the air. As the night deepened, the wind picked up again, more violently this time. The trees groaned, bending against the gusts, and the fire flickered, casting strange, long shadows across the ground. Michael and I both instinctively turned our attention to the trees at the edge of the clearing, where something seemed to be moving just outside the reach of the firelight. "What is that?" I asked, voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Michael replied, his tone suddenly tense. There's something out there. The whispering stopped abruptly, as if in response to his words. For a long moment, everything was eerily silent. I could feel my pulse quicken as the air grew colder, and I thought I saw something move in the darkness, a flicker of motion at the edge of the trees. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, scanning the woods around us. The beam of light barely cut through the blackness, but I saw nothing. No animals, no wind-blown branches, nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched only intensified. I turned to Michael, who was standing too, now on edge. Let's head back to the car, he suggested, his voice low. There was a hint of anxiety in his tone that I hadn't heard before. Michael wasn't the type to get spooked, and the sudden change in his demeanor made me uneasy. I agreed without hesitation. We grabbed our gear and started making our way back down the trail, not wanting to waste any more time in that unsettling spot. But as we walked, the whispers returned, louder, clearer. They were all around us now, as though the very forest was alive with them. Every so often, the sound of a branch snapping or the rustle of leaves would make me glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing just behind us. But there was nothing there. The trail seemed different now. It was darker, colder, and the path I had once known so well was now unfamiliar, twisting in strange directions. I could feel my heart rate increasing, and my breath became shallow, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was as though the woods themselves were pulling us deeper into their grip. We came across an old abandoned cabin just off the trail, one I didn't remember ever seeing before. The structure was decayed, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it had been there for decades, untouched by time. The door was slightly ajar, and I instinctively took a step back. Michael, we shouldn't, he interrupted me, his voice tense. We should check it out. Maybe we'll find something that explains all this. Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. The air inside was thick with dust and mold, the beams of our flashlights illuminating old furniture covered in layers of cobwebs. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight as we moved cautiously through the rooms. It didn't take long for us to realize that this place wasn't just abandoned. It had been forgotten. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. As we entered the last room at the back of the cabin, we found it, an old cracked mirror hanging on the wall. But the reflection wasn't right. It was distorted, the edges of the glass warped as though something was moving behind it. And that's when I saw it, a figure, barely visible at first, standing just behind us. I could barely make out its features, but the shape was unmistakable. A man, his face hollow and pale, his eyes wide and empty. I screamed and turned, but when I looked back, there was nothing there. The mirror was just a mirror again, reflecting only the dim light of our flashlights. Without saying a word, Michael grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the cabin. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead, and even then, we didn't look back. The whispers were gone, but the oppressive feeling in the air lingered, and I could still feel the cold grip of the forest on my skin. When we finally made it to the parking lot, we didn't speak for a long time. The moon was high now, casting long shadows across the empty lot. I didn't want to go back to the wilderness, but I knew I had to. Whatever had happened out there, it wasn't over. It had followed us, and I could feel it lingering in the air. We got in the car and drove away, but that the forest had marked us. I don't know what it was, whether it was a spirit, a ghost, or something far older, but I do know this. The wilderness is not always a place of peace. Sometimes it's a place where things are forgotten for a reason, and sometimes it's better to leave them undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The hikers who had gone missing, the eerie experiences, the strange sightings in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, the kind of place that tourists didn't know much about, tucked away in the thickest parts of the woods. But I didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings. I figured the stories were exaggerations or wild tales spun by locals. It was supposed to be an easy hike, one I could do in 3 or 4 days. A perfect getaway to clear my head. The trip started innocuously enough. I drove out from Seattle, following the twisting mountain roads towards the trailhead. The sky was overcast, and a thin drizzle began falling as I parked my car and checked my gear. I was used to hiking in the rain, and this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The trail was isolated, no signs of anyone else around, but I didn't mind the solitude. I wanted to be alone. I set off in the late afternoon, and the forest around me quickly closed in. The tall trees, their bark thick and gnarled with age, loomed overhead, creating an eerie green canopy that blocked out much of the daylight. The trail was narrow, winding between the trees, the ground slick from the rain. As I walked, I heard nothing but the sound of my boots hitting the wet earth and the occasional distant bird call. I wasn't far into the hike when I found the first sign of something unusual. It was an old, weathered signpost, half hidden by overgrown vines. It marked the way to a scenic overlook that wasn't on my map. Curious, I decided to follow it. The sign was crooked, its paint barely visible under layers of dirt and moss. The more I walked, the quieter it became. The trees closed in tighter around me and the forest felt dense, almost suffocating. It was unlike any place I had hiked before. There was no sound now, no wind, no animals, just silence. I pressed on, feeling increasingly uneasy, but dismissing the feeling as nerves. I didn't want to turn back, especially when I had already come so far. After about another hour of hiking, I arrived at a small clearing, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. It wasn't much of an overlook, just a patch of grass and some rocks with a view of the dense forest stretching out in every direction. But there was something strange about it. The atmosphere felt off, like the place was old, forgotten, abandoned. The last rays of sunlight disappeared, and with it came a sudden drop in temperature. I quickly set up camp, pitching my tent under the trees, close to a small creek that trickled through the clearing. The sound of the water was calming at first, but as night fell, I realized how isolated I truly was. I built a small fire and sat close to it, hoping it would offer some comfort in the oppressive silence of the woods. That's when I noticed it, the first sound that wasn't from the rain or my fire, a faint whisper. It was distant, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too intentional. It sounded like voices, muffled and indistinct, just beyond the trees. I froze, straining my ears. The whispering didn't stop, it only grew louder. It sounded like multiple voices, speaking in hushed tones, a language I couldn't understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that it was probably just the wind playing tricks on me, or maybe the sound of animals moving through the forest. But it wasn't just wind. The voices were too clear, too deliberate. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a sense of urgency to them. And it wasn't the kind of whispering I'd ever heard in nature before. It wasn't the soft rustling of leaves or the whisper of the wind through the branches. It was something else. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and moved toward the source of the sound. But the deeper I went into the forest, the quieter the voices became. It wasn't that they faded away. It was more like they were being silenced by something. I felt a chill run down my spine as I ventured further, the cold air hanging thick around me. The trees here were older, their trunks wider, their bark dark and cracked. There was a strange, unsettling stillness now, a pressure in the air that made it feel like the forest itself was holding its breath. I searched for what felt like hours, but the more I moved, the more disoriented I became. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone. The way the shadows seemed to shift at the edges of my vision. The sensation of being followed, though when I turned, there was no one there. Finally, exhausted and unnerved, I made my way back to my camp. The fire had burned low, and the creek's soft murmuring seemed somehow distant now. As I sat down by the fire, I tried to push away the unease that gripped me, but the voices hadn't stopped. They were still there, echoing in the back of my mind, even though the forest was silent. I barely slept that night. The whispers didn't stop. I could hear them just beyond the firelight, growing more distinct and clear as the hours passed. They sounded like they were calling me, beckoning me to follow. But I stayed in my tent, too afraid to go out, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I packed up my camp early, desperate to get moving. I knew I had to leave. The hike had taken a toll on my nerves, and I didn't want to be out there any longer. The unease clung to me as I made my way back to the trail, the sound of my boots crunching on the wet earth the only noise in the stillness. The further I walked, the more the oppressive silence weighed on me, and the more I became certain that something was watching me from the forest. Hours passed, and as the day stretched into afternoon, I reached the junction where the trail split. But something was wrong. The trail I had taken to get to the overlook, where I had parked my car, was gone. I checked my map and GPS, but they didn't match. The trail, the path I had walked just the day before, was nowhere to be found. Confused, I tried retracing my steps, but every turn I made led me deeper into unfamiliar terrain. The landscape had changed subtly but unmistakably. The trees were denser, the ground softer, the creek I had followed now completely gone. I walked for hours, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but there was nothing. The sense of being lost settled into my chest like a stone. As the sun began to set, panic started to creep in. I wasn't sure how far I had walked, but everything felt wrong. The forest was closing in around me again, just like it had the night before. There were no signs of any other hikers, no wildlife, no sounds of nature, just that suffocating silence. That's when I saw it again, the signpost, the one that had pointed to the overlook. It stood crookedly in the distance, half covered in vines and moss, as if it had been there for years, untouched. But this time, something was different about it. It wasn't just the sign, there was a figure standing beside it. A person. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone who had gotten lost too. But as I drew closer, I realized that the figure wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, just staring at me. I called out, but there was no answer. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached. As I got closer, the figure's features became clearer. It was a man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and skin that looked pale, almost waxy. His clothes were ragged and torn, as if he had been out there for years. The man didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt the weight of something dark pressing in on me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man's gaze was locked on me, his eyes empty and unblinking. There was nothing alive in those eyes. Then, without warning, he turned and walked into the trees. I blinked, and he was gone. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps, my head was spinning. I ran in the opposite direction, not caring about my gear or anything else. I had to get out of there. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead. When I finally saw my car, I collapsed into the seat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I drove straight to the nearest town, never once looking back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in those woods was not human. It wasn't just a ghost or a figment of my imagination. It was something else. And it's still out there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The Canadian wilderness had always been a second home to Marcus. Growing up in British Columbia, he spent much of his childhood exploring the vast forests with his grandfather, who had been a trapper in his younger years. After serving in the military, Marcus returned to his roots, working as a hunting guide for tourists who wanted to experience the wild. He knew the land better than most. He knew the trails, the rivers, the places where you could walk for days and never see another soul, but some places even he avoided. The area known as Dead Man's Ridge was one of them. It was a stretch of high ground, deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest road. Stories had been passed down about it, old tales from the indigenous people, later whispered among trappers and hunters. People who went there sometimes didn't come back. Those who did returned changed. Marcus had always dismissed the stories as superstition. The wilderness could be dangerous. It wasn't spirits or curses that killed people. It was exposure, accidents, and the unforgiving terrain. Then, in the fall of 2018, he saw it for himself. That year, he was leading a client, a wealthy businessman from Vancouver named Tom Lyle, on a week-long hunting expedition. Tom was inexperienced but eager and had insisted on going as deep into the wilderness as possible. By the fourth day, they were over 40 miles from civilization. The terrain was rugged, but Marcus had chosen a good campsite near a river. The hunting had been good. Tom had managed to bag a large elk the day before, and they planned to start heading back the next morning. That night, something changed. It started with the sound. Marcus had been sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle, while Tom finished off a bottle of whiskey inside his tent. The night was clear, the sky full of stars, and the only sound was the rushing of the river. Then, from somewhere in the darkness came the first noise, a distant echoing whistle. Marcus froze. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was human. A long, drawn-out whistle, repeating itself every few seconds. Tom unzipped his tent. "Did you hear that?" Marcus nodded, setting his rifle aside. "Stay here." He grabbed his flashlight and stood, scanning the trees. The whistling had stopped. The forest was silent. Too silent. Marcus had spent years in the wilderness. He knew the way sound carried, the way the woods breathed at night. Something felt wrong. Then, a whisper. It was faint, almost lost beneath the river's current. Not in English. Marcus tightened his grip on the flashlight, his pulse picking up speed. He called out, "Anyone out there?" No response. Just silence. Then Tom swore. "Marcus, the elk." Marcus turned to where they had hung the elk carcass from a tree 100 feet from camp. It was gone. Not just dragged off by scavengers. The rope they had used to hang it was still tied to the tree, cut clean through. A bear wouldn't do that. A wolf wouldn't do that. Someone had taken it. Marcus grabbed his rifle. "We're leaving. Now." Tom was still groggy from the whiskey, but sobered up quickly as he saw the look on Marcus's face. They packed up in record time, moving fast through the dark, guided by Marcus's GPS. They hiked for hours, putting as much distance between themselves and the campsite as possible. Marcus set a brutal pace, his senses on high alert. He felt it. Something following them, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. A branch snapped in the distance. Then a whisper. Closer this time. Marcus turned, shining the flashlight into the trees. Nothing. Then, movement. A figure. Tall. Thin, standing between the trees, watching. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. Marcus didn't breathe. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its face barely visible in the dim light. Then, slowly, it smiled. Not a natural smile, a too wide, too stretched grin. Marcus raised his rifle, and the figure was gone. Not ran, not stepped back. Gone. The whispering started again, coming from all directions now. Tom grabbed Marcus's arm. "What the hell is that?" Marcus didn't answer. He just pushed forward, hiking faster, the speck, his instincts screaming at him to run. They didn't stop until dawn. By then, Marcus's legs were shaking from exhaustion. Tom collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. For the first time since leaving camp, the woods were silent again. But Marcus still felt it. Watching. Waiting. They made it back to the truck by late afternoon. As soon as they reached the vehicle, Marcus felt the weight lift. Whatever it was, it stayed in the woods. Tom never spoke about what happened. When they reached town, he got in his car and drove away without another word. Marcus never went back. But sometimes late at night, when the wind was just right, he swore he could still hear the whistle, calling him back. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Ethan had spent most of his life in the outdoors. Growing up in Alaska, he learned how to hunt, fish, and survive in some of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. After leaving the military, he became a guide, taking clients deep into the wilderness for weeks at a time. He loved the solitude, the quiet, but there was one trip he never talked about, a hunting expedition in the Yukon. It was late September, just before the first heavy snowfall. A client named Richard Halloway, a retired surgeon from California, had hired Ethan to take him deep into the backcountry. Richard was wealthy, but inexperienced, and he wanted a trophy moose, something he could hang on the wall of his lodge in Montana. Ethan had planned everything carefully. They would fly into a remote hunting cabin, then travel by boat and foot, following the river deeper into the wild. It was a place few people had ever stepped foot in, miles from the nearest road. For the first few days, things went smoothly. They set up camp along the river, tracking moose through the valley. The weather was perfect, cool but clear. Then on the 4th day, they found the cabin. It wasn't on any of Ethan's maps. They had been hiking along a ridgeline when they saw it, a small, weathered structure hidden in the trees. The wood was old, gray, and warped with time. A single window, broken. The door slightly open. Richard wanted to check it out. Ethan didn't. Something about it felt wrong. But Richard insisted, so they approached cautiously. Ethan pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rot. The cabin was empty, no furniture, no signs that anyone had lived there for years. Except for one thing, the walls were covered in writing, scratched into the wood with something sharp, not words, just marks. Dozens of them, long, deep gouges crisscrossing every surface. Some were fresh, others old. Ethan felt his stomach twist. "We should go," he said. Richard laughed. "It's just an old trapper's shack." But Ethan knew better. Something had been there, recently. They left the cabin behind, making camp several miles away near the river. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, listening. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no animals, just silence. A whisper. Not from the trees, from behind him. He spun, his heart hammering. The forest was empty, nothing but darkness beyond the firelight. But he knew he wasn't alone. The next day, Richard shot a moose. It was a clean kill, and Ethan was relieved. They would pack the meat, head back to the cabin, and wait for the bush plane. But that night, something came into camp. Ethan woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Circling the tent, he reached for his rifle, his pulse pounding. "Richard," he whispered. No answer. He crawled out of his tent, his breath visible in the cold night air. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows. And then, movement. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, thin, watching. Ethan raised his rifle. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a smile. Wide. Too wide. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired. The gunshot echoed through the valley, but when the smoke cleared, nothing. The figure was gone. Richard stumbled out of his tent. "What the hell was that?" Ethan didn't answer. He grabbed his gear. "We're leaving." They hiked through the night, moving fast, but the whispering followed, soft, just behind them. By dawn, they reached the cabin. Ethan had never been so relieved to see it, but something was different. The door was closed. The marks on the walls, there were more of them, fresh, scratched deep into the wood. Ethan didn't go inside. He didn't need to. He could feel it, watching, waiting. The bush plane arrived that afternoon. Ethan never spoke about what happened. Richard never went on another hunting trip. But sometimes late at night, when the wind was just right, Ethan could still hear the whispering, calling him back.
Story number 6.
There's something about the wilderness that changes people. The isolation, the wild, untamed landscapes. It gets under your skin, and no matter how much you want to escape it, you're always a little bit more connected to the land. That's why I chose to be a ranger. It was always just me, my pack, and the woods. I worked as a park ranger in Wyoming for nearly 6 years. I was responsible for patrolling some of the most remote areas of the park, far away from the main trails and the popular tourist spots. Most of my time was spent on the edges of the wilderness, places people rarely went. There's a certain kind of peace in that, the kind that gets into your bones, the quiet that only the wilderness can offer. But there are things out there, things that can't be explained by logic or reason. It all started one crisp autumn afternoon. I was assigned to check on a cabin deep in the park that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. It wasn't a common duty, but sometimes we do checks on old structures to make sure they hadn't become a hazard for hikers or wildlife. This particular cabin was located by an old dried-up creek near a dense patch of pine trees. I had been there before, but it was always on the edge of my mind. Something about that place felt wrong, like it was just a little bit off. I had never told anyone, but it always felt as though someone was watching me when I was there. I brushed it off as superstition, but that feeling never quite left me. I loaded up my truck early in the morning, the cool air biting at my skin as I set out. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the sky was painted in shades of deep orange and pink. The drive was long and the roads even longer, winding through some of the most desolate parts of the park. I didn't see a single soul during the whole trip, just the occasional deer darting out of the woods and into the fields. When I finally reached the cabin, I could already feel that familiar unease crawling up my spine. The area around the cabin was eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The ground was littered with dry leaves and fallen branches, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. I parked my truck and grabbed my pack. The cabin was only a short walk away, but the closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to get. The sound of crunching leaves beneath my boots felt deafening in the quiet of the forest. I approached the cabin cautiously, taking in the sight of its weathered exterior. The wood was old, faded, and worn from years of neglect. The door hung slightly ajar, the hinges rusty and creaking in the wind. There was a strange scent in the air, something musty and stale like old wood and decay. I stepped inside, my boots scraping against the dusty floorboards. The interior was just as I remembered it, bare, with nothing but old, rotting furniture and peeling wallpaper. There were remnants of a fireplace, its stone mantel cracked, and the walls were lined with darkened beams. Dust floated in the air, thick and heavy. I was there to inspect the place for any signs of decay or damage that could pose a risk. But something made me linger. It wasn't a rational thought, but I had to go up to the second floor. There were 2 rooms up there, but one had always been locked, an old, rusted lock that no one had bothered to fix in years. I climbed the creaky staircase, the wood groaning beneath my weight. As I reached the top, I saw the door to the locked room. The lock had been removed, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing it open. What I saw inside chilled me to my core. The room was barren except for a single object, a large oval mirror mounted on the far wall. It was old, tarnished, and framed in intricate carvings. But it wasn't the mirror that made my heart race. It was the reflection in it. There was someone standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I took a few steps back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been alone when I entered. The door had been closed when I came upstairs. No one could have slipped in behind me. I approached the mirror again, warily. The figure in the reflection was still there, but as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't me. It was a man, tall, thin, and wearing a faded shirt and jeans, but his face was blurred, as if it was being distorted by something unseen. I reached out toward the mirror, feeling the cold glass beneath my fingers. The figure seemed to shift, as if reacting to my movement. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the reflection vanished. I pulled my hand back, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the inspection anymore. Something wasn't right in that cabin, and I wasn't about to stick around to figure it out. I rushed downstairs and out of the cabin, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the mirror standing in the doorway, watching me. But there was nothing. I quickly made my way back to the truck, throwing my pack into the bed and starting the engine. As I drove away, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It stayed with me, pressing in on me like an invisible weight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, what I had seen in the mirror, the feeling of being followed. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but I couldn't ignore the creeping dread that had settled deep inside me. The next day, I reported what had happened to my supervisor. He listened patiently, nodding along, but when I mentioned the mirror, he grew quiet. "I've heard stories about that cabin," he said after a long pause. "People who stayed there said they saw things, strange things, but no one's ever been able to explain it. Just don't go back there, all right? It's best to let that place be." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. Whatever was happening there, it was more than I could handle. But it wasn't just the cabin that bothered me. It was the forest. The place seemed to be alive in a way that I couldn't understand, as if it had a memory of its own, a dark history that lingered in the trees and the soil. Weeks passed, and I did my best to forget about the cabin. But the unease never left me. Every time I entered the woods, I felt that same heavy air, that feeling of being watched. The whispers of the forest seemed to grow louder with each passing day. One evening, I took a different route to check on a different part of the park. The sky was darkening and a cold breeze blew through the trees. I didn't think much of it until I saw it, just a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. I stopped, heart racing, and looked around. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure, tall, thin, with blurred features, just like the one from the mirror. I didn't wait to see if it would move. I turned and ran, not caring if I was making noise or disturbing the animals around me. I didn't stop until I was back in the ranger station, where the warmth and safety of civilization made me feel a little less insane. I never spoke of what I had seen again. The forest had claimed its hold on me, and no matter how far I ran, it followed me. The woods were alive with something ancient, something that never let you forget it, something that lingered in the corners of your mind and whispered your name when you least expected it. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had always been drawn to the wilderness, the quiet, the solitude, the vast expanses of untouched nature. There was nothing quite like it. I had spent most of my life hiking, camping, and backpacking in remote areas across the country, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered one summer. It was the middle of June, and the air was still warm, but the mountain trails in Colorado were calling me. I had read about a secluded trail leading up to an old ranger station that hadn't been in use for decades. It was a hike that not many people took anymore, mostly due to its remoteness and the difficulty of the terrain. I, however, was eager to take on the challenge. I had spent years exploring the backcountry, and this trail promised to be everything I loved about the wilderness: wild, untamed, and almost untouched by human hands. I packed my gear, tent, food, sleeping bag, and set out on what was supposed to be a 4-day trip. The first day was nothing out of the ordinary. The trail was challenging, but I was used to the climb. The air was thin at higher altitudes, but the views were breathtaking. I could see the jagged peaks of the Rockies in the distance, snow-capped even in the middle of June, and the forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of the wind in the trees. I set up camp that first night at a small clearing about halfway up the mountain. I had hoped to reach the old ranger station by the second day, but the hike had been more strenuous than I had anticipated. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. I built a fire, ate some dried food, and settled into my tent, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything tangible, just a sense that the wilderness was watching me, that the silence of the night was somehow heavier than it should have been. The second day was a bit harder, but I made it to the edge of the ridge where the old ranger station was supposed to be. There was no sign of it, no building, no remnants, just the thick forest and rocks. I spent hours searching the area, but found nothing. Frustrated, I sat down on a large rock and surveyed the landscape. Maybe I had taken the wrong turn somewhere, or the station had been dismantled long ago, but it didn't make sense. I had studied the maps carefully, and this was the place. I decided to camp there for the night. It was close enough to the ridge to keep an eye on the surroundings, but far enough into the trees to feel sheltered. The sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest. As darkness crept in, I set up my tent and made another fire. The crackling flames provided a sense of security, but that unsettling feeling from the previous night returned, stronger this time. Around midnight, I woke up. I don't know what caused me to stir. Maybe it was the crackling of the fire or the wind, but I opened my eyes and listened. There was something in the distance. It wasn't an animal. There was no growling or rustling, just a faint, rhythmic sound. It was like someone walking, but not the crunching sound of footsteps on leaves or dirt. No, this sound was more fluid, like someone moving in a way that was too smooth, too unnatural. I listened for a few moments, trying to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the longer I lay there, the clearer it became that it was someone, moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, my heart racing. The light flickered as I swept it across the clearing, but I saw nothing. The forest was still and dark, the fire's glow barely illuminating the area around me. I kept the beam of the flashlight steady, scanning the perimeter of the camp, my fingers gripping the flashlight tightly. Nothing. I felt ridiculous for even considering that someone else could be out there. This was remote wilderness. There were no other hikers, no rangers. It was just me. I lay back down, trying to calm myself, but the sound didn't stop. It was faint, but it was there. Too close now. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I slowly unzipped the tent again, more cautiously this time, and peered out into the darkness. A shape moved across the clearing, just beyond the firelight. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, slender, and moving with a disturbing smoothness, as though gliding rather than walking. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I shone it toward the figure. But as the light hit, it flickered, and the figure disappeared. The air felt thick. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I tried to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or the reflection of a tree, or even my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I zipped the tent up tightly and tried to push the feeling away. I barely slept the rest of the night, constantly aware of the movement in the trees just outside the glow of the fire. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. My gear was all in place and the fire had burned out. The sounds from the night before seemed like a distant memory, but the unease remained. I packed up my camp quickly, eager to continue the hike and put the previous night behind me. The trail leading further into the wilderness was narrow and overgrown, the trees crowding the path on either side. It was difficult to find footing, and the air was dense with the smell of pine and damp earth. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. By midday, I came upon what I was looking for, the remains of an old ranger station. It was dilapidated, the roof caved in, and the walls crumbling with age. A rusted sign was half buried in the underbrush, barely legible. It seemed like no one had come here in years. I decided to explore it. The silence was oppressive, the air still and heavy. I entered the building, careful not to disturb anything. Inside, it was as though time had stopped. Papers and maps were scattered on the floor, yellowed with age, and broken furniture lay strewn about. The place had a strange, almost suffocating energy, like it was still waiting for someone to come back. As I explored the rooms, I came across something odd. In one corner of the building, covered by a pile of debris, was a small, cracked mirror. It looked old, its frame carved with intricate designs that seemed almost too precise. I picked it up, wiping off the dust, and immediately felt a jolt of recognition. This mirror. It was the same one I had seen the night before, in the clearing. I felt my pulse quicken. I had never seen this mirror before today, so how could it be the same one from the night before? My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or maybe I had seen something similar at another time. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I turned to leave the room when I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from outside. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen, unable to move. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It was almost as if someone or something was walking in the shadows, just out of sight. I sprinted out of the ranger station, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. As I ran through the forest, the sound of footsteps seemed to follow me, echoing in the distance, never quite close enough to catch. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, gasping for air, too terrified to look behind me. I made my way back down the mountain, never once looking over my shoulder. I didn't return to the trail for years. Something about that place, about what I had seen, stayed with me. The wilderness no longer felt like the comforting escape it once had. Instead, it felt like a place that could hold secrets too dark for human understanding. I don't know what I saw out there or what followed me, but I know I'll never forget it. I haven't hiked those mountains since, and I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I had always been a person who sought solitude. The busy hum of city life never really appealed to me, and I found peace in the quiet spaces of the wilderness. As a park ranger in Montana, I was fortunate enough to spend most of my time in the backcountry. I often worked alone, patrolling deep into the forest, far away from the well-worn trails and tourist-heavy areas. The wilderness had a raw, untamed beauty to it, and the silence was a welcome relief from the noise of the world. One summer, I was assigned a solo patrol in an area of the park that had a reputation for being off-limits to most hikers. It was rugged and wild, with cliffs, dense trees, and treacherous terrain that kept the casual adventurers at bay. The place had a certain lore about it, whispered among the old-timers. They'd speak of strange occurrences, odd sounds, and the feeling that something's always watching. But I'd always chalk those stories up to old superstitions, nothing more than tall tales told by people who had spent too many nights out under the stars. That year, I was sent to patrol a particularly remote section that hadn't been checked in years. The trail wasn't even marked on most maps. It was a trail I had only heard about in passing from other rangers. A trail that wound its way up into the mountains and then disappeared into the dense trees. It was a place where the land was rugged and the trees were older than most could imagine. If you wanted isolation, this was the place to find it. I packed my gear and set out early, eager to spend a few days alone in the wild. The journey began like so many others, Crisp morning air, the smell of pine and fresh earth, the sound of my boots crunching against the ground. I followed the faint trail, which became more and more obscure as I ascended. The higher I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The towering trees cast long shadows, and the air grew thick, damp with the moisture that clung to the leaves and branches. I could feel the silence, and it felt heavier than usual, as though it were pressing against my chest. By the time I reached the area where I was supposed to camp, the sun had begun to dip behind the mountains. I set up my tent near a small creek, its sound the only thing breaking the silence. The surrounding woods were dense, and the trees felt old, much older than the usual forest I was accustomed to. They seemed to loom over me, their branches twisting in strange shapes, creating odd shadows that flickered in the dying light. That night, I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal and letting my mind wander. I knew the next day would be a long hike, so I went to bed early. The silence around me was absolute, the kind that you only get when you're deep in the wilderness. There were no sounds of animals, no insects buzzing, nothing but the crackling of my fire and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. I woke in the middle of the night, my sleep disturbed by an odd feeling. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was cold, the darkness outside oppressive. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt wrong. Unnatural, even. I strained to hear any sounds from the outside, but the forest was silent, too silent. I tried to shake off the feeling and settled back into my sleeping bag. But then I heard it. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like something walking slowly through the underbrush, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, listening. It wasn't an animal. The movement was too deliberate. I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered outside, scanning the darkness. The firelight barely touched the edges of the trees, and the shadows seemed to move in odd ways, as if they weren't quite right. I saw nothing but the forest stretching out before me. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was out there. I got out of the tent, my boots crunching softly on the ground, and I walked to the edge of the clearing. The night was cold, the air thick with moisture. I strained my eyes, searching the darkness, but there was nothing, just the rustling of branches in the wind. I stood there for a long time, my nerves tingling, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Finally, I decided it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I'd been alone in the woods for too long. I went back to my tent, locked the flap, and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up my things quickly, eager to leave the eerie campsite behind me. But as I started my hike the next day, something didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual sense of peace I had come to expect in the wilderness. Instead, it felt as though the forest was watching me. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the ground itself was resisting my movements. The trail was difficult to follow, with trees growing close together and the underbrush thick and tangled. But as I pushed deeper into the forest, I began to notice something strange. There were marks on the trees, deep, jagged gouges that looked like claw marks, but they were far too high up to be from any animal I knew. They were too precise, almost deliberate, as though something or someone had been marking its territory. I stopped to examine one of the marks, running my hand along the rough surface. It was fresh, too fresh. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively reached for the small knife at my belt. I was no stranger to danger in the wild, but something about this felt different. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. The trail led me further into the mountains, and the trees seemed to grow even older and more twisted, their gnarled roots snaking through the ground like ancient fingers. I had no idea how much time had passed when I suddenly heard it again, the soft, shuffling sound. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was closer this time, just at the edge of my hearing. My heart raced as I turned around, scanning the woods behind me, but again there was nothing. I started walking faster, my footsteps quickening. But the sound kept pace with me, always just a little behind, never loud enough to be an animal, but never far enough to be ignored. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my chest tightened with panic. Then I saw it. At the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its form almost blending into the forest around it. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, cold and unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, staring at the shape, unable to move. The figure didn't move, but I could sense that it was watching me. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, the kind that comes before something terrible happens. I knew I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed, staring at the figure, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, without warning, it was gone. The figure simply vanished into the trees as though it had never been there at all. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, only that I didn't stop until I was back at the trailhead, gasping for breath, my heart racing in my chest. I never looked back. I didn't even bother to grab my gear, just my pack and the essentials. I left the forest that day and never returned. For years, I tried to rationalize what had happened, chalk it up to exhaustion, bad dreams, or the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I saw. Something was out there in those woods, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for someone like me to stumble upon it. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. The woods are beautiful, yes, but there are things there that can't be explained. Things that shouldn't be. And I learned the hard way that some places are better left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I've been working as a backcountry ranger for almost 10 years now, spending weeks at a time alone in the woods, far away from the noise and chaos of the world. The wilderness was my sanctuary, a place where I could forget everything, family drama, stressful work, personal issues, and just focus on the land. But there's a place I was assigned to last summer that still sends a shiver down my spine whenever I think about it. It was an area of the park so remote that very few people ventured into it. The dense forest stretched for miles, and the thick underbrush made it difficult to even walk through. Most of the trails in the park avoided the area entirely because of its reputation. Locals called it the Lost Hollow, an old name that had been passed down through generations. The land had a history that no one liked to talk about. On the first day of my patrol, I wasn't aware of any of these stories. I was new to the job, excited to get my first solo assignment in such a remote place. The sun had just come up as I packed my gear and double-checked my map. There was an old, abandoned logging camp that I needed to inspect, and a few old ranger stations tucked away in the woods. My supervisor had given me the details, but nothing out of the ordinary. The rest of the morning was spent hiking through dense forests, with the occasional clearing offering a glimpse of the sky. By midday, I found myself at the edge of a long, narrow canyon. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of pine and wet earth heavy in my nose. The trail dipped into the canyon and curved up along the ridge, the perfect spot to make camp for the night. I set up my tent near a stream, the sound of the water running over rocks creating a peaceful backdrop. There were no signs of other campers, no trash or fire rings. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. I spent the evening gathering wood and making a small fire. As night fell, I cooked my meal and sat by the flames, watching the shadows of the trees dance across the ground. I was a little on edge, but it was nothing new. The wilderness could sometimes be unsettling, but I had learned to live with it. It was a part of the job. Around midnight, I was lying in my tent, listening to the wind rustle through the trees when I heard it. A soft noise, almost like footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal. The pace was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone was walking nearby. I quickly got up and grabbed my flashlight, scanning the area around my tent. Nothing. The forest was still. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. The wind had a way of making strange sounds, especially in the middle of the night. But as I lay back down, the noise came again. This time, it was closer, just on the other side of my tent. I froze. I wasn't the type to be easily frightened, but I could feel my pulse quicken. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear any more sounds. But there was nothing. I finally decided to take a look outside. I slowly unzipped the door of my tent, holding the flashlight in front of me. I looked around the campsite, but there was no one there. The forest was quiet again. The sound of the wind in the trees the only thing I could hear. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the ground. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. I stood for a few moments, trying to calm my nerves, before deciding that I had just imagined it. The night was peaceful once again, and I went back to bed. The next morning, I packed up my campsite and continued my hike. I had a long way to go and needed to reach the abandoned ranger station by noon. The day passed uneventfully. The forest was dense and the trail narrow, but I moved steadily, eager to finish my patrol and head back to the ranger station for a hot meal and a bed. By the time I arrived at the old station, the sun was beginning to set. The building was run down, the roof sagging, and the windows boarded up. It had been abandoned for decades, and it looked every bit its age. I approached cautiously, feeling a strange sense of unease. There was no reason for me to feel this way. It was just an old building, after all, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped closer. I tried the door. It creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of mildew and decay filled my nostrils. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight over the old desk, the rusted tools scattered around the room. It was clear that no one had been here in a long time. I explored the building, checking for any signs of vandalism or damage. Everything seemed untouched. But something caught my eye, a piece of paper on the floor, wedged between two broken floorboards. I picked it up carefully, brushing off the dust. It was old, yellowed with age, and written in a language I didn't recognize. The symbols were strange, curved and jagged, almost as if they had been scrawled in a hurry. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the paper. It didn't make sense. There was nothing about the station or the area that had any history with strange languages or anything that could explain this. My instincts told me to put it back, to forget I had ever seen it. But curiosity got the best of me, and I folded it up and slipped it into my pocket. The rest of my evening was uneventful. I set up camp near the ranger station and made a small fire. I thought about the paper, wondering if I should show it to anyone, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt uneasy. Something about the symbols had unsettled me. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they meant something that wasn't meant for me to understand. That night, as I sat by the fire, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. It wasn't unusual for the wind to come through the canyon like that, but there was something different about it. It sounded almost deliberate, as though it were carrying something with it. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. They were faint at first, but they grew louder. Someone or something was walking in the woods. This time, I was ready. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, scanning the forest around me. The footsteps were slow, methodical, moving from one side of my camp to the other. I shone my light into the trees, but I saw nothing. No movement. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was only silence. Then the wind picked up, and I heard something else. A voice. A low whisper, coming from the direction of the abandoned ranger station. "Get out!" I couldn't move. The voice was distant, but it was clear. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind. It was as if someone or something was warning me to leave. I looked at the ranger station, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the broken windows. I grabbed my gear and didn't look back. The hike out of the forest was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't look around. The whispers followed me, faint and distant, but constant. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw the familiar rangers' vehicles in the parking lot, I felt a rush of relief. I never went back to that part of the park. I still can't explain what happened, but I've heard rumors from other rangers. Some say the area is cursed. Others claim that the woods are haunted by the spirits of those who never left. I don't know what the truth is, but I'll never forget the footsteps, the whispers, and the feeling that something or someone was watching me. Some places are better left untouched. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
The sun was setting low on the horizon as I stood on the edge of the ridge, looking out over the sprawling wilderness below. It was my first season as a backcountry ranger, and my job had taken me to some of the most remote, rugged areas of the national park. It was a job I had longed for, a way to escape the monotony of city life. The wilderness had always been a place of solace for me, where the silence and solitude could wash away the stress of everyday living. The area I was assigned to patrol was known for being especially isolated. It had a reputation among my fellow rangers for being a place where the land was harsh and unforgiving, with dense forests, steep cliffs, and unpredictable weather patterns. It was also the kind of place that people rarely ventured into, just the way I liked it. I had been out there for nearly a week, alone, and each day felt more like a blessing than a burden. The routine was simple: check the campgrounds, inspect the trails, ensure that no one was trespassing, and maintain the equipment. I was alone most of the time, and I found comfort in the absence of human voices. The wilderness was alive with the sounds of nature, but otherwise it was a realm untouched by civilization. But there was something about the place that unsettled me. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, no specific threat or danger. The land was quiet, too quiet, almost as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the sun's rays never seemed to break through the canopy of trees the way they did elsewhere in the park. On the fourth day of my patrol, I hiked deeper into the backcountry, far from the usual trails and campsites. I had heard stories about an old hunting cabin deep in the woods, long abandoned and in disrepair. The locals referred to it as the Lost Cabin. It had been part of the park's history, but it had fallen into neglect decades ago. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was just a relic of a bygone era. Curious, I decided to search for it. The trail that led to the cabin was faint, barely visible, and became progressively harder to follow the further I ventured. The trees grew dense, their roots twisted and knotted like old, gnarled hands, pushing against the earth. A thick fog began to roll in from the valley below, settling in the underbrush and obscuring the path. I kept moving, determined to find the cabin before nightfall. As I walked, I began to notice something strange. The further I went into the woods, the more I could hear what sounded like whispers. Soft murmurs carried by the wind, almost as if someone was speaking just beyond the trees. It was faint at first, and I thought it might have been the wind playing tricks on my ears. But as I pressed on, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't words I could make out, but the tone was unmistakable, low, guttural, and unsettling. My heart rate quickened. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was in the wilderness. Anything could be the wind or the rustling of branches, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step I took. I finally reached a clearing, and there, partially hidden by the trees, was the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, a decaying structure of wood and stone, half sunken into the earth. The roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. A broken porch sagged in the front, and the windows were nothing but black voids. It looked as though no one had been there for decades, yet something about the place made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I walked cautiously toward the cabin, my flashlight sweeping over the darkened walls. The whispers were louder now, closer, but still I couldn't make out any words. I felt a pressure in the air, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried the door, which creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and decay. The wooden floorboards groaned under my weight, and dust danced in the beams of my flashlight. The cabin seemed small, cramped, but what struck me most was the overwhelming sense of abandonment. There were old furniture pieces, chairs, a table, a small cot, but everything was rotting and falling apart. A fireplace lay in the corner, but it was empty, cold. There were no signs that anyone had been there in years. I spent some time inside, cautiously examining the place. There was nothing unusual at first, just decay, age, and the remnants of a lifelong forgotten. But as I moved toward the back of the cabin, I noticed something strange. There, hidden beneath the layers of dust and debris, was a small wooden box. It was old, with intricate carvings on the surface, and it had a worn, weathered look to it. My curiosity got the best of me, and I knelt down to open it. The moment I touched the box, a chill ran down my spine. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. The whispers, which had been faint before, now filled the cabin, echoing in the walls. They were louder, more frantic, and I could almost feel them pressing against my ears. My fingers shook as I lifted the lid of the box, revealing what was inside. At first I thought it was just a bundle of old cloth. But as I pulled it out, I realized it wasn't fabric. It was a tattered, yellowed piece of paper. It was covered in strange symbols, some kind of writing I had never seen before. My heart began to race as I stared at it. The whispers grew louder still, surrounding me, and I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I shoved the paper back into the box, slammed the lid shut, and backed away quickly. The air felt thick with malevolence, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I didn't even look back as I ran out of the cabin, my flashlight flickering in the fog as I stumbled through the trees, my breath ragged in my chest. When I returned to my campsite that night, I was shaken, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened. I couldn't explain the whispers or the cold sensation that had filled the cabin. It was as though the very land itself had become alive with something ancient and dark. But it was the box and the strange paper inside it that haunted me the most. I didn't know what those symbols meant, but I knew I didn't want to find out. The next day, I returned to the cabin in the daylight. The fog had lifted and the forest seemed eerily quiet. When I reached the cabin, I found that the door had been left ajar, as though it had been opened recently. But when I stepped inside, I saw that everything was just as it had been the night before. The box was still on the floor where I had left it. The air felt heavy again, but the whispers had stopped. It was as though nothing had changed, as though the strange presence had vanished. But it wasn't over. That night, I heard the whispers again. They came from the direction of the cabin, faint and distant at first, but they grew louder as the hours passed. And then, in the dead of night, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps outside my tent. I froze, my heart pounding. There was no wind, no reason for anyone to be out there, but the sound was unmistakable. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the footsteps circled the campsite, always just beyond the edge of the firelight. And then, as quickly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent. I didn't sleep that night, and when the first light of dawn broke, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother to finish my patrol or check in with the others. I left the wilderness behind, not knowing if I would ever return. It's been years now, but I still think about that place. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again, faintly, as if they are calling me back to the cabin. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, just beyond the edge of the light. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. Some places I've learned are best left alone. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The wind whispered through the trees, a low, eerie moan that never seemed to die down. The dense forest pressed in on all sides, the thick canopy swallowing what little light remained of the setting sun. Mark Connolly pulled his jacket tighter around his body and adjusted the straps of his heavy backpack. He had been hiking for 3 days now, alone, deep into the heart of the Cascades. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to clear his head after his divorce, to remind himself that life existed beyond the sterile walls of his apartment. His plan was simple. Follow the old trails, make camp near the lake, and disappear from civilization for a week. He had read about a secluded spot, an unmarked section of the forest where the trees grew thicker, where the ground sloped steeply downward into a hollow that locals simply called the Drowning Pit. He wasn't superstitious, but the name intrigued him. He had spent the morning hiking along an old game trail that hadn't been maintained in years. The deeper he went, the more unnatural everything felt. The air was thick and damp. The trees gnarled and twisted. It smelled of wet earth and decay. He hadn't seen another soul since he left the main trail. No other campers, no rangers. Even the birds had stopped singing. As dusk settled, he found himself standing at the edge of a strange clearing. The ground here sloped downward into a shallow depression, thick with undergrowth. In the dying light, he spotted something half buried in the dirt, a wooden signpost, long since fallen and rotted with age. Brushing away the leaves, he could barely make out the faded, carved letters. "Do not go beyond this point." A shiver ran down his spine. He exhaled, shaking off the feeling, and pushed forward. Superstitious nonsense, he told himself, just an old warning left behind by some long-forgotten ranger. His tent was pitched within the hour, a small fire crackling beside it. He sat on a fallen log, stirring a pot of instant noodles over the flames, listening to the night sounds. But there were no sounds, no insects, no owls, just the occasional creak of tree limbs swaying in the wind. And then he heard it. A voice. Soft. Whispering. Mark froze, his spoon hovering over the pot. The voice was distant, almost carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill through his body. It was pleading, desperate. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond his firelight. Nothing. Then a sharp snap of a branch to his left. His breath caught in his throat. He squinted into the tree line. The fire cast long shadows, twisting and shifting with the flickering flames. For a moment, he thought he saw movement. A figure just at the edge of sight. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then another voice, this time from behind him. A whispering murmur, impossibly close. His blood turned to ice. Spinning, he grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the clearing. The beam caught something, just for a fraction of a second. A face, pale and gaunt, staring at him from the trees. The moment the light touched it, the figure melted into the darkness. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He grabbed his knife, clutching it tightly. The whispers grew louder. They came from every direction now, overlapping, forming a sickening, incoherent chorus. He couldn't tell if they were human. His flashlight flickered. Then the fire went out. Darkness swallowed the clearing. Something moved, right in front of him. He bolted for his tent, yanking the zipper shut behind him, as if that thin sheet of fabric would somehow protect him. The whispers swirled outside, growing frantic, urgent. And then, silence. An unbearable stillness pressed in from all sides. Hours passed. He sat in his tent, gripping his knife, every muscle in his body wound tight. His flashlight battery was nearly dead. He didn't dare move. Then, just as he started to drift into a restless sleep, a sound made his blood run cold. A single, raspy breath. Inside the tent, right behind him, his body went rigid. He could feel the heat of something breathing against the back of his neck. His mind screamed for him to run, to move, but his body refused to obey. Then in the darkness, something touched his shoulder. A hand, cold and damp. He lunged forward, clawing at the zipper, tumbling out into the open air. His flashlight flickered wildly as he whipped it around. Nothing. The tent was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps. He grabbed his pack, not bothering to pack up the rest of his gear, and ran. He didn't care where, he just needed to get out. The forest seemed to close in around him. The trees twisted unnaturally, the branches reaching for him like skeletal fingers. The whispers followed, growing louder. The air grew thick, oppressive, and then the ground beneath him gave way. He fell. Tumbling down the steep incline, he crashed through roots and rocks, the breath knocked from his lungs. He landed hard at the bottom of the hollow, his head spinning. Dirt and leaves clung to his skin. He groaned, struggling to sit up. And then he saw them. Figures, half buried in the soil, corpses, their skins stretched tight over skeletal frames, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Their hollow eye sockets bore into him, and they were moving, hands clawing at the dirt, reaching for him. Mark scrambled to his feet, slipping in the loose soil. The whispers had become a deafening wail, voices shrieking inside his skull. "Join us." A bony hand closed around his ankle. He kicked wildly, breaking free, clawing his way up the slope. His lungs burned, his vision blurred. He ran. Branches whipped his face, roots clawed at his ankles. The forest seemed endless. Then, light. The first pale rays of dawn. He stumbled onto the main trail, collapsing onto the dirt. The whispers ceased. The oppressive weight lifted. Hours later, a ranger found him wandering the road, his face pale, his hands trembling. They never found his tent or his gear or any trace that he had ever been there. But Mark knew what he had seen, and he knew he had barely escaped, because as they drove him back to town, he saw it, just beyond the trees. A pale, gaunt face watching him and smiling. Story the end.